Democracy sounds like the perfect system, one person, one vote, right? But what if I told you that the math behind democracy doesn't always add up? In fact, there are several shocking facts that prove democracy isn't as fair and flawless as we're led to believe. For example, did you know that in 2000, nearly 100,000 people in Florida voted for Al Gore, but ended up with George W. Bush as president? Why? Because of something called the spoiler effect, where a third-party candidate divided the vote. This wasn't a one-time fluke. Studies show that gerrymandering and electoral college distort real democracy, leading to results where the majority doesn't always get what they want. What about voting systems? The Condorcet Paradox shows that sometimes, even when every person votes fairly, the winner still doesn't represent the majority. Sounds crazy, right? In this video, we'll explore these surprising and little-known truths about democracy. We'll break down the math and reveal how voter paradoxes, the tyranny of the median voter, and hidden power struggles make democracy not only imperfect but, in some cases, mathematically impossible. Stick around, you'll never look at democracy the same way again. Chapter 1, The Paradox of Majority Rule in Any Democracy. We're taught that majority rule is the foundation of fairness. But here's the catch, majority rule isn't always as logical as it seems. The Condorcet Paradox is one of the most mind-boggling facts about democratic voting. It proves that even if every person votes logically and fairly, a majority might still not reflect the best outcome. Imagine this, in an election with three candidates, A, B, and C, A could beat B, B could beat C, and yet C could beat A. This is a paradox. The majority preference contradicts itself, and no one candidate truly wins. It's a mess. In 1950, the mathematician and political theorist, Kenneth Arrow, proved this mathematically with his impossibility theorem. It showed that no voting system can perfectly translate individual preferences into a fair outcome. Arrow's theorem says that it's impossible to create a system that satisfies three criteria at once: fairness, collective rationality, and freedom of choice. So, when you vote for a candidate, you're actually participating in a system that might not reflect the actual will of the people at all. Quite the paradox, right? This mathematical flaw reveals something we often overlook: majority rule can still lead to outcomes that no one actually prefers. It can create a winner who isn't the people's true choice. Instead of a system where everyone's voice counts equally, it's a system where the result can be inconsistent and, well, sometimes completely wrong. Chapter 2, The Impossibility of Perfect Representation. Have you ever felt that your vote didn't really matter? It's not just a feeling, it's backed by math. In the realm of democracy, the idea of perfect representation is a myth. Let's talk about Arrow's impossibility theorem again, because it plays a huge role here. Arrow's work shows that no voting system can fully reflect every voter's true preferences without creating contradictions. This means that in any democracy, some voices are always left out. For instance, think about how voting districts are drawn. Often, these district lines aren't drawn to represent communities fairly. Instead, they're manipulated in a process called gerrymandering, which gives certain political groups an unfair advantage. It's estimated that in the US, gerrymandering impacts elections so much that it can change the outcome of up to 30% of elections. That's a huge number. Democracy promises that all people will be heard, but the way districts are divided often means that people in rural areas or underrepresented communities get less influence. Even though they're the ones voting, they have a mathematically smaller impact on the final outcome. If we look at proportional representation systems in countries like Germany, the voting method still falls short. The system might appear fairer than the American winner-takes-all system, but it still fails to represent every voter equally. For example, in Germany, a party list system allows parties to be represented in proportion to their vote share. But even here, smaller parties often get squeezed out of meaningful power. Mathematically, no system can perfectly reflect everyone's wishes. Democracy, as we know it, simply doesn't work that way. Chapter 3, The Tyranny of the Median Voter. Now, let's turn to something called the median voter theorem. This principle suggests that in a democracy, the candidate who appeals to the median voter, essentially, the person whose views are in the center, wins the election. This sounds good in theory. After all, a moderate candidate should represent the broadest range of people, right? Here's the catch: the median voter isn't always representative of the majority. In a polarized society, the middle ground might be irrelevant or out of touch with the needs of more extreme groups. Let's say you're in a country where the political views are sharply divided. A candidate in the center might get the most votes, but they may only appeal to 30–40% of the population, leaving the rest unrepresented. This happens because the system incentivizes politicians to focus on the median voter, pushing out more extreme, but often important, ideas. In the US, studies show that the median voter often influences legislation more than the actual majority. In fact, a 2014 study by political scientists Martin Gilens and Benjamin I. Page found that the policy preferences of wealthy Americans have a significantly greater impact on lawmaking than the views of average voters. That means, in practice, the voice of the median voter isn't just about ideology, it's also about economic power. Politicians, especially in two-party systems, don't want to alienate the middle. As a result, they often adopt centrist views and policies, even if those policies don't address the more radical or urgent needs of society. The system mathematically rewards mediocrity, because in a world of political extremes, playing it safe is the surest path to power. The reality is, this focus on the center stifles progress. Ideas that could fundamentally change the system, ideas that may be unpopular but necessary, struggle to make it through the democratic process. Why? Because the political landscape doesn't reward bold solutions, only moderate compromises. If you found this chapter insightful, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to dive deeper into the next chapters and more shocking insights about democracy. Chapter 4, Voter Paradoxes, the science of non-democratic choices. When we vote, we assume that our individual preferences are counted fairly, but democracy doesn't always work that way. Voter paradoxes, like the spoiler effect, prove that democracy doesn't guarantee the best or most representative outcome. The spoiler effect happens when a candidate splits the vote with another similar candidate, allowing a less popular candidate to win. This has happened in several key US elections. For example, in the 2000 presidential election, Ralph Nader, a third-party candidate, is often blamed for pulling votes away from Al Gore, ultimately leading to George W. Bush's victory. Many people believed that Gore was the real choice of the majority, but the system gave the win to Bush due to vote splitting. The voting paradox is another key issue. This paradox happens when the outcome of an election depends not just on who wins, but also on how the choices are ordered. Imagine you're voting between three candidates, A, B, and C. If the order of voting changes, it can alter the final result, even though the preferences of voters remain the same. Mathematically, this shows that voting systems can produce inconsistent outcomes. The most surprising part of these paradoxes is that they occur even in the most democratic systems. A well-known study by political scientist Kenneth Shepsell found that nearly all voting methods, including the seemingly fair ones, are susceptible to such paradoxes. The result? Democracy's mathematical foundation is shaky. The ideal of perfect representation is, sadly, out of reach because individual votes don't always correlate with the actual preferences of the majority. These issues show how flawed democracy can be when it comes to aggregating the preferences of voters. Voter paradoxes undermine the idea that our votes lead to a clear, rational, and representative outcome. Chapter 5, Power, Not Votes, the hidden math behind influence. While democracy promises equal voting power, the reality is much different. Voter influence isn't just about casting a ballot, it's also about power. In fact, studies show that some votes matter more than others. Take gerrymandering, for example, where district boundaries are manipulated to favor one political party over another. In the US, gerrymandering can result in elections where the majority of voters in a state support one party, but the other party wins a disproportionate number of seats. In North Carolina, for instance, in the 2016 election, the Democratic Party 48 won and 50% of the votes but only secured 23% of the seats in the state legislature. That's a huge discrepancy. Similarly, the Electoral College system in the United States magnifies this issue. The Electoral College gives more weight to votes in less populated states. For example, in Wyoming, each vote counts nearly 4 times as much as a vote in California. Mathematically, this gives some voters much more power than others, violating the principle of one person, one vote. A surprising twist here is the disenfranchisement of voters. Whether through strict voter ID laws, limited voting hours, or voter purges, millions of eligible voters are kept out of the democratic process. Research shows that between 2016 and 2020, over 17 million Americans were removed from voter rolls. Many of these individuals were from low-income or minority communities. This isn't just a technical glitch, it's a direct violation of their constitutional rights, and it has a very real impact on election outcomes. The fact is, democracy is not just about who votes, it's also about who has the power to shape the voting process. The structure of the system itself can determine the results more than the votes themselves. The hidden mathematics behind political influence means that in many cases, the will of the people is far from being realized. Enjoying this series? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. There's more coming on how democracy fails to deliver. Chapter 6, The Death of Dissent. How democracy kills true change. One of the most troubling aspects of democracy is how it stifles bold, innovative ideas in favor of maintaining the status quo. The system naturally gravitates towards moderation, which can prevent radical, yet necessary, change. In a two-party system like the one in the United States, candidates are often pressured to adopt centrist positions to win the majority. As a result, even the most urgent issues, like climate change or economic inequality, are often ignored in favor of compromise solutions that fail to make a significant impact. The median voter theorem again plays a role here. The theory suggests that to win an election, a candidate must appeal to the voter in the middle. The problem is that this middle ground approach often overlooks more extreme but critical issues that could require drastic action. This leads to the phenomenon known as policy gridlock, where urgent issues are either neglected or met with weak, half-hearted solutions. Moreover, radical change often requires breaking the rules, which is exactly what democracy's inherent structure resists. This resistance to change is built into the mathematical framework of representative democracy. Politicians and voters alike are conditioned to favor stability, even if it means avoiding essential reforms. The system tends to favor small adjustments over large-scale transformation, meaning that truly revolutionary ideas, those that could solve deep-rooted societal problems, are sidelined. A chilling example of this can be seen in how democracy responds to climate change. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence, climate change policies have often been watered down or delayed. According to a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the global community has only made incremental progress on addressing climate change over the past few decades, despite growing urgency. Why? Because politicians are too focused on short-term wins to enact the bold, long-term policies needed to combat a global crisis. It's not just climate change. Healthcare reform, economic justice, and even education policy are often bogged down by democratic structures that prioritize gradual, less disruptive change over bold solutions. Democracy, as it currently exists, kills true dissent because it rewards the politics of compromise, leaving behind the ideas that could really reshape the future. If you found this exploration eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more deep dives into the real-world impacts of democracy's flaws.